thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's good to see a very good full house, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting discussion on what is something that a lot of people keep talking about, and especially since the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts since 2001. I was based in Baghdad for 2 years, and then previously before that in Afghanistan. And as I was coming here this evening, I was just remembering journeys into the green zone from our house in Baghdad, in the city. And every time, just to make that journey, we would come across perhaps 4 or 5 different private military security outfits to go from to simply to make that short trip. Sometimes we would be getting out of the way very, very quickly along the roads of Baghdad as an unidentified private security outfit would be coming towards us. Then once we were inside the green zone, once we got through American military checkpoints, we would then have to get through several different other companies, Triple Canopy, who had Peruvians. We also had regular military, the Georgians. Then there would be private security, perhaps working with Iraqis. And this is the sort of nature of what anyone who goes to Afghanistan or Iraq faces now. So here, this evening, to talk about all these different issues, we have 4 people coming from quite different backgrounds on things. Andy Bearpark, here to my right, is the Director General of the British Association of Private Security Companies, and also, Andy, you served in Iraq with the Coalition Provisional Authority up until its demise.
Indeed.
Yep. And Ruth Tanner here is from War and Want, and takes a slightly different view on whether or not this is a good thing. Adam Roberts has written what is now a very successful book on Simon Mann and the Wonga coup. And Tony Geraghty has written what is being seen as the definitive guide to the private security industry. And I'd like to ask you, Tony, first of all, to give us a kind of overview of the private military security industry and where things are right now, particularly since the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts.
Right, well, thank you, Andrew. I hope people can hear me. Do we have a mic? Thank you very much. I have a voice problem. I'd like to pretend that it was a bayonet thrust in the Khyber Pass around 1890. I'm afraid the truth is more prosaic. I've not only been a soldier, but after a lifetime as a journo, a scribe and a war reporter, I've had to eat my words so frequently that it's indigestion, really. So I've been invited to do a very quick but ambitious tour d'horizon of the whole business. I'd like to offer you an interesting historical symmetry. History is not bunk, as Ford would have alleged. It becomes more relevant with the better perspective we get. And what we see is, in my view, the clock turning full circle. There was a golden age for freelance soldiering prior to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, when the nation state became an entity. National armies started to take over, manned by citizens, took over from the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and so on. And what we now have, what fascinates me, is that with the growth of multinationals, we are having a diminution of the power and the role of the state in every sector of public life, economically, as well as in security matters. So what has happened during those years between Treaty of Westphalia and now? Well, two basic traditions, 2 diverging but living traditions, have started to emerge, in my view. One is the Brit and French tradition of fighting counterinsurgency wars. The British using its army of empire, its Gurkhas, whatever. The French having l'Armée d'Afrique, as part of which, of course, was the French Foreign Legion, the only bit still to exist. The Brits learned their modern counterinsurgency 1918, 1921 from the ex-postman Michael Collins, who became a charismatic and very successful guerrilla leader in throwing the Brits out of Ireland. I have mixed feelings about that. I have an Irish passport as well as a British passport. I served with the Paras, but I can also see where the Irish are coming from in these matters. Also, having been arrested more than once during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and having experienced a certain amount of interesting confrontation there over the years, I can see it I hope from both points of view. What the Brits learned fighting Collins was that irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, dirty tricks, including assassination, can be politically effective if intelligently applied. So that people such as Colonel Gummins and others went on to create SOE, the SAS, as its offspring. Brigadier Mike Calvert, the man who created the Malayan Scouts brackets SAS in Malaya during the immediate post-war years, once in a giveaway moment said to me, you know, Tony, I always envisaged the post-war SAS not as a regular part of the ORBAT, the order of battle, but as a sort of modern black and tans. He did not pick up upon my Gaelic origins, but in spite of that, I smiled through my teeth at him. So that what we have is as a tradition on the British side, if you like, which has a vocational dimension, a belief in a cause. Sure, people want to be paid for what they do, but people such as those who went into the Yemen in 1962, having got discharged from the SAS to become mercenaries, fighting on a small battlefield as part of the Cold War, they were paid. But as they tell me, they were there for reasons of patriotism. After the 1976 debacle in Angola, a distinguished judge said, well, you can't define a mercenary by his motives. It's what he does that matters. Well, maybe so. The other tradition, which I'd like to point you to, is the American one, where the privatized use of force has always enjoyed a respectability which it is not, on the whole, in European history, not since 1640, whatever it was. So that you had Mr. Pinkerton, the migrant from Glasgow, going to America in the 19th century to invent the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It was a strike-breaking organization as well as a close protection organization. It killed people and was killed in turn sometimes by, who else? Irishmen working under the group title of the Molly Maguires. That tradition is one which continues to the present day, as most of you who've followed the fortunes and misfortunes of the modern American companies will be aware, from Blackwater through to the great logistical companies. So what we now have, as I say, is an interesting circular process historically. We're coming back now to a geopolitical situation in which the nation state has a less tight grip, less control over the use of organized military force. I've been asked about definitions. Well, these are numerous, frequently legalistic and political. I prefer the terms freelance soldier to cover the culture of professional fighters who work for pay beyond the reach of governments. Some fulfill the modern definition mercenaries, a synonym for dogs of war, in that they seek to overturn established governments and profit from anarchy. Others defend the established order, usually using limited firepower and in a passive role. A very expert close protection officer who was with the RMP at the time, looking after some of the royals, one said to me, and he gave me the title for a book on the subject, "You know, Tony, we guys are merely bullet catchers. That's our function." But the question of how far can you take your role of passive defence raises some interesting philosophical questions. If you are armed with 9mm Brownings, anything up to a .50 Browning in Iraq or Afghanistan, and the other guys are starting to use RPGs against you, and you outgun, at what point does your defensive system appear in the eyes of journalists and the world at large, therefore, to be an offensive programme? Which is the tail and which is the dog in that situation? There are no perfect answers to the questions that I pose, of course. I'm smart. The close protection officers will often protect institutions and laws as bodyguards and security advisors working for commercial companies which, in theory, are exposed to the disciplines of the market in an open society. This group has grown, as we know, phenomenally with the evolution of multinational corporations, more powerful than governments, and in the military area, more effective than the logistical arm even of the US military. There's a third group, of course, the clandestine deniable warriors who work for governments out of patriotism and are also paid for their services, but money is not their main motivation. The money side. Well, we're discussing, as we all also know, a multi-billion pound industry which functions globally, recruits internationally. The Iraq bubble left to the unaccountable disappearance of millions of dollars of Iraqi oil revenues, as well as American taxpayers' contributions. War on Want reports, a body which I much respect, that British security company profits soared from £320 million in 2003 to more than 1.8 billion in 2004. In the same year, the security industry worldwide enjoyed a turnover of 100 billion. Accountability and regulation. Well, this is often tenuous and sometimes results in human rights abuse. This I know a little about because back in 1976, I'd penetrated a group of mercenaries. Like me, they'd served with the parachute regiment. Unlike me, they'd been dishonourably discharged and led by a rather psychopathic London Cypriot called Costas Georgiou, who called himself Colonel Callan. They went off to Angola and started massacring one another. As a preliminary to that, some of them had an assassination contract on my life. It was not taken up, as the proposed assassin confesses in one of his books, because the money on offer was not sufficient to make it worth the risk. There you go. You win some, you lose some. The UK, in terms of control, still depends on a 19th century law written before air travel, and I love this. And therefore, it refers only to illegal recruitment of freelance soldiers linked to movements by sea. And yet Helen Blair recently in the House of Commons was still citing the Foreign Enlistment Act 1817 aid. It's the only bit of legal fig leaf that the woman has, and doesn't she need it? Meanwhile, the reforms proposed in a UK Green Paper in 2002 lie unused, collecting mould. There is, of course, the International Criminal Court, unrecognised, undermined by the United States, and as yet untested as a means of controlling freelance soldiers. The Iraqi and Afghan governments, as we know, are now walking around, tiptoeing around the possibility of using their own domestic laws, such as they are, in order to impose some control. I've been asked to comment briefly upon Simon Mann. Well, I leave it to Adam, whose excellent book I've read, to address the farcical Wonga plot in detail. I'll offer two quick thoughts about it. First, most people agree that the regime in Equatorial Guinea, which Mann wanted to supplant, is at least as beastly as Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Well, so could it be that the same Blairite morality, whether you call it humanitarian intervention or duty to protect, which is the latest buzzword, I believe, in New York, should they apply equally to both cases? Or again, what are we to make of the morality and wisdom of clandestine British and US operations which brought about regime change in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 90s? Indeed, friends of mine, special forces friends, trained the jihadis in the use of Stinger missiles and other techniques here in the UK. Mrs. Thatcher, I recall, as she then was, turned up on the border with Afghanistan or Pakistan, telling dissident expatriates, well, you are rightfully defending your religion from the incursions of these awful Russians. Brzezinski said, yes, we wanted to lure the Russians into Afghanistan in order to get them involved in their own Vietnam. And that's exactly with the intention, and the result has been a total bloody catastrophe, as we know. I've been asked briefly to comment upon the links between PMCs, government, industry and the media. Well, Andy Bearpark will be able to describe better than I can the delicate quadrille danced around the subject of regulation on the part of PMCs and government over several years. He will confirm, I'm sure, much of the security industry welcomes regulation. It's Whitehall that drags its feet, while simultaneously relying on the services of such companies as Armour Group for the protection of its own officials in war zones. Whereas for industry, I would guess that CBI, for example, is probably ambiguous in its attitude to PMCs, so long as only one UK security company, I think it's still only one, is publicly quoted on the stock market and therefore subject to the full rigours of market disciplines. The media in general adore the stereotypes engendered by words such as mercenary, dogs of war, wild geese, soldiers of fortune, while increasingly depending on those same individuals and companies. John Simpson of the BBC is one such. They depend for their survival upon them. The views, as ever, from the news desk and the frontline foxhole, not for the first time, diverge. I've been asked, finally, examples of good practice. Well, we could consider the worldwide humanitarian work performed by freelance soldiers, for example, in mine clearance, kidnap and ransom, hostage rescue, military training, and even military disarmament missions. In fairness, we should also recognise that most of the tens of thousands of freelance operators in Iraq and Afghanistan do not behave like psychopaths. Those who do make news. Most of those, I know, employ low-profile, capital L, capital P techniques, guile and intelligence to protect their principles and themselves. So, very finally, where are we going with this? Well, private security companies are but one aspect of the growth of the multinational corporation. They reflect also, let me repeat myself, the declining influence of the nation state in a world where, thanks to Blair and Bush, it's acceptable to override national sovereignty, impose regime change, and impose a style of government that's already under challenge in both Britain and America. There'll never be a shortage of soldiers with nowhere to go after regular service, except to the next employer. But if we're to understand the present and predict the future, we need to consider not only the role of the foot soldier, but those entities that ultimately employ him. To whom are they answerable? The experience of the past year, from which most of us are now suffering, I'm sure, suggests that the most dangerous mercenaries are no longer to be found en route Irish, but in Manhattan and London, playing and rigging the futures markets. That's all I want to say.
Well, Andy, I imagine you've got a few things you'd like to respond to in that, but I think just for now, if we can, if you could focus on what you have seen develop in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think this key issue, which is going to go through our discussion throughout the evening, of definitions. Are these companies still mercenaries, or have they become something else? Is it possible to regulate them in any way?
Okay, thank you very much, and nice to see you again, Tony. I think there are a lot of people in this room who I recognise who will, when we go downstairs for a drink, have an extra little drink tonight to celebrate the fact that Mr. Karadzic is tonight behind bars. Now, one of the things that was said time and time again when I was in the Balkans is that they suffered from having too much history. And I do start to feel that way about mercenaries and the industry, the non-mercenary industry, which I represent. If you're an academic and you want to write a paper on the private security industry, it's almost obligatory to put something in the first paragraph about the historical background. So we did a literature search, and the furthest back one we could find was the first official historic reference was the army of King Shulgi of Ur in 2094 BC. Yeah, well, fantastic. Do you think that Michael O'Leary of Ryanair does his shareholders meeting sitting there thinking, I've got to talk to you about Icarus and that guy's wax, I've really got to talk about that today? I don't think so. The industry I represent and I know is the private security companies industry. They're nothing to do with mercenaries at all. There is no definition of mercenary that covers these guys unless you take the one I found on a website this afternoon that said a mercenary is somebody who does something for money. Well, if you take that definition, I'm guessing 98% of you in this room are mercenaries, and I'm putting my hand up, I'm one for sure. No, they're not mercenaries, nor are they private military companies, but we'll probably leave that for a more detailed question. They are a legitimate industry. They're here, and they're here to stay. They're protecting aid workers and journalists in Iraq. They're protecting relief convoys in Afghanistan. They're working with the oil companies to drill in the Niger Delta. These are things that we as society want to happen. These are things where there are bad guys. You can say Al-Qaeda if you want to get technical, but let's just say bad guys who are trying to stop these things happening. So the only way they will happen is if the people involved can be given protection. No self-respecting, sane engineer would have gone out to Iraq in 2005 without protection. Some, in fact, did, and they're dead. It's as simple as that. So if we're going to reconstruct these countries, if we're going to drill for oil in vague parts of the world where we never went before, we need a private security industry. Now, I am arguing, and I will argue for the rest of this evening, that there is no connection between that industry and mercenaries. There is no connection between PSCs and Equatorial Guinea. They were misguided, rather stupid, and now very, very unfortunate people who tried to invade Equatorial Guinea. There were no companies listed on the stock market or anywhere else. No, companies don't do that sort of thing. Companies look for growth, and there aren't enough small African countries around to make a good business plan out of it. Likewise, I will argue that there's no link between British, and I do stress the word British, PSCs and CIA Black Ops. They don't get employed on them. Maybe they'd like to, for all I know, but they don't get employed on them. And to the best of my knowledge, although Tony will tell me otherwise, the British government doesn't do that sort of thing. At least that's what the Ministry of Defence tell me, and who am I to argue? But I'm sure that these paths are ones that we'll go down tonight, and they're interesting and worthwhile paths to debate. What I'm just saying now is they've got nothing to do with the bog standard, boring private security company industry that's out there. Having said that, I am the world's greatest advocate for control of that industry. The industry has the ability to do harm. Generally speaking, the regulation test is, do you regulate if an industry can do significant harm? If it can't, you don't. The two extreme examples are the fine art industry. Anybody can go and set up their little banner in a shop and say, I flog oil paintings. If you're daft enough to go and give them $10 million for something that looks atrocious, that's your problem. Society isn't hurting in any way, so there is no regulation of the fine art industry anywhere in the world. The other extreme is the passenger aircraft industry, which is probably the most regulated industry in the world because you have no other way of exercising your rights. If you fly in a dodgy aeroplane and it crashes, you're not going to sue. The odds are really heavily against that because you'll be dead. You can't even use choice because by the time you know the aircraft's dodgy, you're dead. So you can't fly in a different one next time. And what's even worse, very much like the private security industry, is that the harm can often be caused to third sets of people. It's an aeroplane from, don't use an example or they'll sue. It's an aeroplane from Nigeria, they never sue. It's an aeroplane from Nigeria overflying London that crashes, killing British people. You had no contract with that airline, you have no ability to influence the government of Nigeria, but you're dead. So industries like the aircraft passenger industry are very heavily regulated, and I would argue that the private security company industry has the ability to cause significant harm and therefore needs regulation as well. But where you will find a little bit of dissent later on, and that's what makes it interesting, is how do you go about that? Passing regulations as a form of virility is great fun. That's what the South African government did with its Foreign Enlistment Act. Have they managed a single prosecution under it? Well, I'd like to say no for effect, but the answer is they did manage to prosecute Mark Thatcher, didn't they? So, yeah, I mean, it can have a symbolic effect, I suppose. But if what we're truly interested in is the control of an industry, the prevention of human rights abuses, and the proper investigation of those abuses when they occur, there is no silver bullet out there. I'll put my hand up, contrary to what some people will think, and say I personally, the association I belong to, and the members of that association are all 100% in favour of British government regulation. There's no hesitation. We're not saying but, we're not saying comma, we're not saying however. We are in favour of British government regulation. But we're having a hell of a job persuading them to do it. And meanwhile, even that wouldn't be a silver bullet. This is a transnational industry operating in weird and wonderful places, employing third country nationals. So national legislation alone is never going to be the answer. We need international control as well. We need international codes of conduct. We need international norms of practice. And then at the bottom of the pile, and it is the bottom of the pile, is the little world in which I live, and that's self-regulation. We have never, ever argued, nor will we ever argue, that self-regulation is the answer with the little word "the" in front of answer. What we're arguing is to control those human rights abuses, to bring people to account, you need international regulation and national regulation and self-regulation, that all three of them have got a part to play, and if you're missing any one, you're not controlling the human rights abuses in the way that you would wish to. And just for the record, we do think it's wrong to invade Equatorial Guinea, however nasty and despicable and horrible the people there in charge were. But we're having second thoughts about Zimbabwe, but maybe it's going to go better, so we'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yeah, and one thing I should say, which I meant to say at the beginning, was that we, the BBC, and most other television networks working in Iraq, we have had to use security personnel to carry on our work, and it would have been impossible for us to carry on doing so over the last few years if we had not had that kind of backup. That's the nature of the conflict it has become. At the same time, we also witnessed the confusion that was there, and I think that may be something that Ruth may want to talk about. What is the result, Ruth, do you believe, of the current situation where private military security companies, and we're going to keep trying to discuss what we call these things, are they mercenaries doing good, or are they doing harm?
Well, we took up this issue, War and Want took up this issue a few years ago. This has been a debate that's been ongoing, and we have been looking at basically the links. You know, we're a poverty charity. We campaign and we have partners around the world, and a lot of our partners work in conflict areas. You know, people who are, you know, in Colombia working on displacement that happens to Colombians because of the conflict there, in Palestine, and we also have partners in Iraq. And so we took up this issue because we were looking at that very clear link between conflict and poverty, and between corporations, conflict and poverty. And this is something that I think there's that sort of benign sense of the market, you know, that old concept that if a McDonald's was there, then you wouldn't have a war, you know, the kind of Cold War analysis. And, you know, we've been taking that up, and so we've been looking at a lot of different industries, one of those industries being the extractives industry, where, you know, we know that if you're an Anglo-American, say, or an Anglo-Gold Ashanti in Colombia, that you're going to have private security looking after your mine. And we're working with the citizens, the people in those countries who are having to, you know, the unions who are having to live with the results of those companies existing there, because, you know, they're getting attacked. People, you know, union officials are disappearing, and that very blurred line between paramilitaries and private companies. So that's something, that's very much where we're coming from. And although on this question of are they mercenaries or aren't they mercenaries, I mean, I think this is, it's a distraction in the sense that it's about whether this industry can legitimise itself or not, whether this industry can mainstream itself or not, and can say that because we feel we're needed, therefore we're okay, or are they the Simon Man mercenaries? I mean, my issue for our partners, for the people we work with around the world, is actually what they're doing on the ground and what the results are for people. So we started looking at this issue because we saw this in a way that maybe the arms trade, you know, there's an analysis around the arms trade, there's some sort of process in the UK on what happens with the arms trade. And we saw this essentially in the same way that, you know, we're talking about people going out and carrying guns. We're not talking about the guns themselves, but essentially they hold a similar role in terms of what the UK industry is. So we did a report on this a few years ago, which you can get copies at the back, and we looked at the growth. And I think even we were shocked at just how huge this industry is now. That, you know, when, as you were talking about the Green Paper in 2002, when the government did that Green Paper, it was responding to the Sandline affair. So it was responding to, you know, old school mercenaries. And what we've seen is some of the same people, some of the same personnel, but also other security companies, companies that really were fitting burglar alarms 10 years ago, that are now merging together and have come to Iraq and Afghanistan, and have, in a way that Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Iraq, has seen this, you know, Iraq Inc., Iraq PLC, the sense of, you know, privatisation and opening up Iraq to this neoliberal model. PMSCs have been right in the middle of that. So, you know, we know that British and American PMSCs make up about 85% of the whole industry. So we're very much part of this. And it went very, very quickly from, you know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of pounds to billions in this industry. Some companies were very small and now are very big. Some companies like Aegis were very much connected in other guises under Tim Spicer to the mercenaries of old, are now having contracts with the US government for $500 million over 2 years. So huge contracts, just massive. And for us, for our partners, for the people we work with in Iraq, there is no underestimating how bad these companies have been for Iraqis. And I think, just to, you know, put it in perspective, it's not that these companies are seen as, you know, almost as bad as occupying forces. For Iraqis, these companies are, you know, are as bad or worse, because the difference is for the soldiers there is some sort of line of control. You know, they know, Iraqis know that, you know, there is potentially some sort of redress. They know for these companies there's none, and frankly, more than that, they don't necessarily even know who these companies are working for, who these soldiers are working for. They just know that they're there. So that sense of it being like the Wild West, and for Iraqis, you know, that they are intimidated and treated, you know, brutishly by these companies, that's very much how they're living. And, you know, we hear that all the time from people we know, you know, on the ground in Iraq. And that idea that this is, you know, this is an, you know, a security as opposed to military or something. I think when you're in Iraq, that line is blurred, and I think that what makes Iraq so unique. You know, and when you're on the streets of Baghdad, as you were saying, that line just isn't there. That, and you see that with the most, you know, legitimate companies operating. So Armour Group, now part of G4S. So very much part of the security, not the military sector. Armour Group at the beginning of 2007, I think it was something like 297 times, almost 300 times in 3 months, that they came under attack from insurgents. So we're talking about the companies that work for the British government. And it's true that the British government is, you know, one of the kind of the areas where this has opened up, that the British government are employing them, the BBC are employing them, the UN are employing them. But they're also being employed by the private companies, by the oil industry, which, you know, is in the process of trying to push through the privatisation of Iraq's oil, the opening up of Iraq's oil to foreign investment. So this is very much linked to an agenda in Iraq, an agenda in the Middle East. that isn't just about protecting the BBC or protecting the UN, it's about protecting corporate interests, global interests. So we know that they're committing human rights abuses, and we know that this is something that the British government, that British industry is doing too. We had a case recently, which I don't know if you saw the Panorama programme, I know it's either been shown or is being shown here very soon, of Eriness, one of the legitimate UK companies. And I think when you see what they've actually done to people when they were following orders, you know, they were doing it within their line of command, apparently, that they shot at a taxi near Kirkuk in a very relatively quiet area, middle-aged taxi driver, 3 people in the back, journalists in the back, driving along. And one of them...
Can I just make sure that if this is an ongoing case, that I don't know the details of this one, but just so that we're clear that this is a live event, so
yeah, and this
just
this
be
is
careful
a case
how you put it.
Yeah, this is a case that was on Panorama and will be shown
right.
here. That the taxi was shot at. They were following their line of command, but we still ended up with a guy who's lost his eye and another guy who's lost his ear. So this is, you know, this is serious. So we're talking about UK companies. We're talking about very much the British industry being at the head of this. So obviously UK legislation, UK regulation is needed. And I'm very glad to hear Andy talking about the industry being on side, and that's absolutely true. We've seen, you know, we're very pleased to have seen a really big shift in the last year. We know that at the first BAPSC conference, Malcolm Rifkin, who was sort of a face for Armour Group, was talking about a voluntary approach. We're now seeing the companies themselves, we're seeing the UN, we're seeing MPs talking about proper regulation. We had on Sunday the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, their human rights report saying absolutely the government should be acting now. They need to have something in this Queen's speech, which is something we've been pressing for. So we need clear regulation of these companies. You know, these companies on not just of licensing their very existence, but also the specific activities. And this is something that's been going on since 2002 with the Green Paper. So it is absolutely about British government action and lack of it. So just to finish, I think what I'd like to say is I think the way this is sometimes talked about is that idea that they're necessary, that without them this is a fait accompli, we've already got there. And we haven't already got there. In America, they're looking at how they regulate these companies, how they talk about these companies, and it's not going very far. It's very much part of the mainstream there. But that debate is happening, it's alive. It was happening in the Democrats' primaries. They were debating over how many guns these guys would be allowed to carry between Hillary and Obama. So this is very much happening in the US. As I say, the South Africans, and for all people's criticisms of the South African law, the reason they've put that legislation in place is because of the apartheid era, because they know that a lot of these guys who are working, the South Africans working, were working for the apartheid regime. So it's happening around the country. You know, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, there's a process in place. They're trying to fight the immunity that these companies have, because at the moment they're operating outside any law, and it's now that we have the time to shape it and make sure that we make that distinction between the military and the security. You know, these aren't bouncers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Yeah, and I think that's something that is very much at the forefront of the discussion right now with regulation, because right now the Iraqis and the Americans are sitting down trying to come up with a status of forces agreement, and one of the issues in that will be whether or not contractors working there have immunity, and still not clear, you know, how that's going to go. But Adam, in some ways, Simon Mann and what happened there, that took us all the way back to the 1960s, really, didn't it? And,
yeah.
Could it happen again? I mean, tell us about the Wonga coup.
I assume that most people in the room probably know the sort of the bare basics of what I call the Wonga coup and the 2004 coup plot against Equatorial Guinea that has been in the news quite a lot in the last few weeks. So I won't go through all the details, but sort of very broadly, it was a very complicated attempt by a group of around 60 mercenaries who were arrested in Zimbabwe, a group of people flying in from the Canary Islands and a few others to get hold of an oil-rich country in West Africa. So it was a rare example of a mercenary-led coup plot. I should kick off with two confessions. Like the BBC, like probably just every other news organisation, we also have made use of mercenaries or private military people or whatever in some capacity at different times.
We don't use mercenaries.
We're trained, we're trained for sort of personal security if you go into dangerous places. And if, in the 1990s, if we were going into Somalia, you would hire a technical and you would hire local guys with guns, and they should also be considered in this broad range of people we're talking about as mercenaries. They're not just Eton-educated former members of the SAS who are mercenaries. There are lots of African mercenaries, lots of people from Ivory Coast going and fighting in other bits of West Africa. And if you really want to talk about the global issue of mercenaries, it's not just about white people going to far-off countries. There's a lot of very murky stuff going on in other countries too. The second confession is I'm a simple journalist, and I do prefer the word mercenary to many of the other words. I think there's a danger to believe people who want us to use jargon that we shouldn't use words that maybe sound a bit pejorative. But if we're honest about this, ultimately this is about people who are prepared to carry guns and use them because they want to make a profit, and that broadly for me is mercenary. So I probably will be very tabloid and journalistic and use that term a bit too much. For the Wonga coup, I think there are a couple of lessons that maybe are relevant here, a couple of points that might be relevant. Is there a very clear line between the sort of people who led the Wonga coup and the sort of people we're mainly talking about tonight? I don't think there's a sort of perfect, clear line between them. If you look at the sort of people involved in the 2004 plot, many of them had close links to the sort of private security industry before they were involved in Equatorial Guinea. If you look at the sort of the ideal of what a sort of private security company was in the early 1990s, it was Executive Outcomes. It was the remarkable private military force in Angola that fought on behalf of the government there, and that spawned various other forms of private military forces. Well, a lot of the same people involved in that venture were then involved in the coup plot and one or two other things. Now, I'm not at all surprised that we want to draw a clear line, because clearly even when media organisations like mine or the BBC make use of people who are expert in military activity, we don't want to be associated with coup plotters either. But I don't think there is a clear line. I think to pretend there is some sort of sacrosanct line is a bit of a lie. I think we should admit that there's a range, and people move up and down this scale. They get involved with one thing at one point and they move into another thing at another point. And maybe what regulation could do is to stop people moving up and down that scale, but there isn't this clear and easily defined line. Some of the people who are involved in the 2004 plot had been serving as private military contractors in Iraq and had come back on holiday to get involved with this one. So literally the same people were hopping from one to the other. The second point, I'd like to take on Tony's point about the decline of the state, and it's sort of been assumed by everyone here that there's this fact that we have to have more and more private military contractors and security people because the state is in great decline. I think that's just wrong. I think the state is very, very strong. The state chooses to act in certain ways, and it may be that if you're the British and the Americans and choosing a war of choice in Iraq, which doesn't have a great deal of popular support, you choose to do it in a certain way. And it may be that if you're Donald Rumsfeld, you think that you should invade with a very small force of proper, American soldiers. And when that goes wrong, you have to rely on private military folk to help you out. But it doesn't have to be like that. States can act in a very different way if they wanted to. If it were felt necessary to invade Iraq, you could have done it with twice as many troops and not had the same need for private military folk to help you out. So we shouldn't assume that there's some sort of great historical trend that says states are in terminal decline. I do disagree with that. I think states are very strong. And we should accept that a lot of this is a matter of choice. And even my sort of slightly exceptional, rather exceptional coup plot story did involve a lot of states. It wasn't just a gang of loonies from, a drinking club and who'd been hanging around at Eton and Sandhurst a bit too much and had a bit too much to drink in bars in South Africa who decided to go and knock over a country as if it were a bank job. I mean, they thought they had the support of states, whether they did or not, they believed they did. They probably did have the quite active support of one state. I think Spain was quite deliberately giving signals and sending ships and making it clear that some recognition would be given if the coup plot succeeded. They certainly, the mercenaries certainly hoped or believed that they would have a nod and a wink from Western governments if they'd succeeded with this. They wrongly believed, but thought they could get away with doing what they did in South Africa and that the state there wouldn't get involved. And they wrongly thought that Angola and Zimbabwe and other useless African states wouldn't be able to stop them. Well, the fact is, all of those states had roles to play in the story that I've told. And in the end, the states triumphed. Even the weak, rubbish African states triumphed over the contractors. So I think if there's a sort of broad assumption behind this discussion that the state is in terminal decline and we have to accept that there's this great role for private companies, we're giving away a bit too much at the outset. This is a matter of choice. And even the sort of weird cases that I talked about here involve states. So that would be my sort of opening salvo.
And I just want to pick up on one of the things you said there, which I think in a way kind of cuts through the heart of this, and ask you, Andy. When we're talking about definitions, when we're talking about regulation, in a way, does it matter however good your self-regulation, or if there's actually a law in Britain regulating these companies? Because a mercenary, a private soldier, whatever you want to call him or her, can always go off. They may work for one of the companies like Armour Group, for instance, which comes under regulation, but they can easily go and join someone else's outfit, as Adam was saying, go backwards and forwards. So what's the point in having tighter regulation?
Because when you've got a problem like that, of course you can't control the foot soldiers. The foot soldiers will move between organisations. It's a well-known historical fact that one of my ex-bodyguards was seen on television walking into Chickaruby jail. These things do happen. But I think that's not so important. I mean, the UK analogy with that would be, a guy could be a computer hacker one day and he could be designing software for Microsoft the following day. If you have the desire to behave immorally or illegally, then you will follow that desire. You could argue with the Wonga coup that people were literally misguided, that some of the foot soldiers didn't know what they were up to. I don't know if that's true. Everybody above a certain level most certainly did, but I'm prepared to believe at the very bottom level there were some who didn't. But with regulation, that's not what worries me. What worries me so much about regulation is that it's almost become a sort of macho point of pride. If we regulate, the world will be better. I mean, I have to take part in that debate, and I have to express my views. But to be quite honest, it doesn't get me excited, because the only thing that would get me excited would be an ability to enforce. If you look at UK law, it is an extraterritorial offence of murder. If you're a British subject and you murder somebody anywhere in the world, you can be dragged in front of what was the Old Bailey, whatever it's called now, and you can be sentenced to life without remission or whatever it may be. So to do an immediate read across to our industry, if you were British and working for Blackwater at the time of that September the 17th occurrence, when it is alleged, if Blackwater's lawyers are watching, when it is alleged that the guards shot when they shouldn't have done and killed innocent Iraqis. If you were British, you've committed an offence. Under British law, you should be in front of the British court. But you're not going to be, because the British police are not going to go out and collect the evidence. So making that an offence, that wasn't made an offence because of my industry, that was made an offence years ago, but making an offence hasn't helped anybody. So I really do think there would be benefit in spending less time looking at regulation and more time looking at enforcement, because surely what we actually want to do is send a clear message that these abuses are not acceptable, and then bring people to account if they've actually engaged in them.
But isn't part of the problem here is that there's been, especially in Iraq, an amazing situation has developed where in some ways the private military contractors are more immune, are harder to prosecute than actually the soldiers. The soldiers have a clear chain of command. They have, in the American case, uniform code of military justice. And on top of that, a lot of the time, if something actually happens, you're out on the streets of Baghdad, you don't know who these people are. And I know, certainly from my own experience, countless times of being run off the road by private security companies. That's all you can tell, but you do have no idea who they are. And so who are you going to call?
Again, I come back to the idea that it's the enforcement that's the problem. I've been manhandled by Blackwater as well. The stories you tell, any NGO, any aid worker will tell you 100 stories about being driven off the road by the 4x4s. But the first thing you said, if I may say so, wasn't correct. The American private security companies are more regulated than the American military. They are subject to the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice. They are subject to MIJA, the military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. So the private security contractors working for Blackwater, Triple Canopy or whatever are subject to all of those laws. The fact is that the American government, for whatever reason, has chosen not to enforce those laws. If you go back all the way to the absolutely abhorrent abuses that took place at Abu Ghraib, there is no doubt whatsoever that the two contractors concerned, Tyson and Kaki, could have been prosecuted under American law. The State Department and DOD chose not to do so. So again, I come back to my point. You can have as many laws and as many rules and as many regulations as you like, but if you don't have the ability and the will to enforce them, then you're getting yourself nowhere.
I think it's probably time to open it up to the floor. So let's see if there's quite a few hands already. Gentleman there put his hand up first, so let's hear from you.
Kavi, let's say that these Florence Nightingales of 21st century are doing a crucial job at the instigation of the British and American governments. It's nothing new, if I may digress for a minute, because in the 18th...
And could I just interrupt you? Is this going to be a question or a statement?
It is going to be a question. Okay. In the 18th century, the Honorable East India Company were the first one to employ these modern-day Florence Nightingales. My question is, your manpower, as I understand it, comes from the British Army officers and soldiers who get their training and what goes with it from the taxpayers' money. The profits their employers make and the handsome remuneration that they themselves get in Iraq and Afghanistan are obviously not subject to taxation. How do you propose this situation to be normalized as any other corporation under our rule of law?
Okay. Do you want to answer?
I think, yeah, Andy, why don't you take that first?
Okay, if I can just separate out 2 points that you made. The first one is the question of taxation. The British government's rules on taxation and whether they charge income tax for people who are working abroad for more than a certain number of months are nothing to do with the private security industry. Exactly the same, I'm pleased to say, applied to me at one stage when I was working on aid projects in the Balkans, and for a few years I managed to avoid paying tax. This is a fiscal issue which is nothing whatsoever to do with the private security industry. On the training side, again, it's not a security issue, it's a labour market issue. There are very many markets out there where, to take an example, pilots who've been trained at vast expense by the RAF, when they retire, usually go off and fly British Airways aeroplanes. The question is, what proportion of loss does the state accept that these people then move off into the private sector? The only time at which that's usually judged to become a worry is if people retire early or resign early, having received that training, to go and work for the private sector. Now, that worry existed particularly back in 2004, 2005, when there were any number of stories about people leaving the British Army to go and work for the private security companies. And the concern wasn't the financial one about the loss of training, it was the fact it was expensive to replace them. So the Ministry of Defence, not me, the Ministry of Defence, did an enormous study into that and found that with a couple of very specific exceptions to do with the SAS and certain communication skills, that it simply wasn't true. Because what happens is, for the companies, they want people generally in their 40s. They really don't want youngsters. They really don't want the scary thing about youngsters who don't know what they're doing. They want 40-year-olds. And there was a perfectly adequate supply of people having served 10, 15 or 20 years with the armed forces coming out of the armed forces. So in security terms, the Ministry of Defence concluded that that wasn't a problem. But the other two issues are labour market issues that exist anywhere. I would argue they're far, far more important in Africa than they are in the UK. Where they get scary is when you take somebody from Sierra Leone who's been earning 5 cents a day, recruit them to work for a PSC and pay them $500 a week, and then you really seriously should worry about what they're going to do when they go back home.
Another question. Gentleman there at the...
Thank you. My name's Bob Shepherd. I'm the author of the book that came out in April, The Circuit. I'm not a journalist. I'm actually a guy on the ground doing what we're talking about this evening. I had a full military career. I've been doing this job 14 years now, and I've been on the circuit in hostile environments, such as the places that we're talking about, mainly Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and where the lady was talking about earlier, Palestine solely. That's where I've been all the time. I was actually told by Frontline earlier, Andrew, that I could have a say as well as a question. So if you don't mind, can I go ahead? Great. I've got my back to the wall because I know it's a mixed audience. First and foremost, in my book, I don't call them PMSCs or PMCs, I call them CSCs, Commercial Security Companies, because the only reason they're in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else is basically to make money. That's not to say that people like myself are there to do the same. We're there basically to make a humble living with the skills that we were given to continue that within the private sector. Okay? Now, I know that the majority of people that I work with, men and women, do the job to the best of their ability. But what I will say is that I don't agree with self-regulation. I believe that that's tantamount to Afghan drug traffickers policing the border with Pakistan. It doesn't work, okay? It has to be external regulation. Now, Andrew, who had a say earlier, was talking about the arts industry. Now, unless you're a glue sniffer, there aren't many people dying in the arts industry. There are a lot of people in my industry coming back in body bags quietly. Okay? And the only way that'll stop is to ensure that we have external regulation. Okay? Andrew, could I ask you a question, please?
Please.
Thank you. The lady kindly mentioned Armour Group, and it's been mentioned 2 or 3 times because it's pretty much out in the open. Since 2006, as Armour Group is part of your organisation, how many people have died in Iraq for them to the present day?
I'm not going down that path. I do not keep the body counts. I could walk out of this room, phone up any of the directors of Armour Group, and they'd give me the answer. I cannot tell you. You probably do know.
Okay. Well, I don't know, and I work on the ground. But I do know it's an awful lot. Now, if you're self-regulating, and you're Mr. Self-Regulator, you should know that. Now, my view is that the BAPSC is basically allowing the companies within it to sweep everything under the carpet and continue the government making its flawed policies. Okay? The government's pretty happy, and they don't want people like the lady rattling their cage about regulation. They're happy with the self-regulation. The big companies under Andrew are headed up by MPs and generals. And I say generals because they never take their uniform off. Okay, they're always generals. These people are well in touch with the government, and they're doing the government's job for them. Security companies cannot replace the military. In the military, it's horses for courses. Okay? If you're a frontline soldier, you're a frontline soldier. If you're a technician, you're a technician. If you're a cook, you're a cook, etc., etc. In the commercial security world, you can be anybody you want to be, as long as you sit a course. Of course, you pay for that yourself. And most of these courses are actually run by the people under the BAPSC. Okay? It's a farce.
Bob, let me ask you a question, though. And it's from what Adam was saying earlier on, that in the end, you call yourself an operative for a commercial security company. Isn't this just another acronym to cover up the fact that you are, in the end, a mercenary? And it doesn't matter what conflict we're talking about, who you're, in the end, it's about being a mercenary.
Okay. if you read my book, the first paragraph actually says, "Don't call me a mercenary." Now, if you call me that tonight, I won't put you through the window because I'm in a really good mood. No, I'm not a mercenary. I see myself as an extension with the skills that I was given in the military to continue looking after people commercially. Now, Andrew's gang can do very, very well in hostile environments, commercial to commercial, looking after the media, which is what I do most of the time. Oil companies, etc., etc. But the problem that we've got, and I'll take Iraq as an example, we're in Iraq within a deeply entrenched insurgency. Now, I'm not compromising anybody by saying this, but in the last week, the media have hit on the poor 5 guys who have been abducted from the Ministry of Finance, and nobody knows what's going on there, okay? We're being told to shut up because the government's doing everything possible, all right? I'm drying up here, I'm sorry. Sorry. Right. If you're working or operating in a deeply entrenched insurgency, commercially, what chance have you got, apart from driving around in an armoured vehicle, loaded with guns, with your fingers crossed, hoping that you don't going to get whacked? I left Iraq in 2004 because I believed I could no longer do my job. I'm not scared. I could no longer do my job with my hand on my heart. So I moved to Afghanistan, where at the moment I can continue to do my job, although that's getting pretty tough now too. If Iraq was an African country, we'd have flown our nationals out years ago. But we've actually got something in Iraq to be there for, okay? And the government are putting people, FCO included, under immense pressure to stay the course. And they're doing the same in Afghanistan, okay? And it's not really on. Now, until we can convince the government that the way ahead for commercial security companies is to externally regulate, and we can do this in the United Kingdom, because I do believe we're actually the best at the job. And we can do this, but we've got to get it right. And as an example, and I'm no specialist in this, because I'm just a guy on the ground, but if you get a nominated MP with no financial ties to the industry, and he gets the right people around him, he can actually kick this off and make a very good go of it. Okay?
Bob, thanks very much.
All right.
Thank you. Tony, I wonder, have you got any response to that? You look like you might have.
I'd like to pick up a couple of points that Adam made. First of all, I think he shares the opinion that Kofi Annan expressed some years ago, that there is no distinction to be made between one sort of freelance soldier and another. They are all mercenaries, I think is the line. And that is your view, apparently. I think I would seek to rebut that on 2 grounds. First of all, there was a time when I used the phrase mercenary soldier in order to shed a little light on what is otherwise a stereotype. The word, I know of only one more emotive, logic-defying word than mercenary, and that word is paedophile. It has an effect which seems to sort of block out any clear analytical thinking, and the word mercenary does absolutely the same thing, whether one wishes this to be the case or not. It would be nice if we all could exercise a sort of pure semantics and understand the nuances between one sort of mercenary and another. But let me pitch this to Adam and perhaps others here. Does the word journalist convey invariably the same pejorative connotations?
Yes, it does.
So if, and it's happened, I'm sure to you, it's happened to me, you meet somebody at a party, and the vicar is there, it's the garden party, and people have got their teacups held at the correct angle, and someone says, "Oh, you're a journalist, I must be careful what I say to you." Now, that sort of attitude is one which is frankly riddled with a stereotype form of thinking. And if we want to make any progress in understanding the private security industry as it is evolving, I think the first thing we've got to do is to get rid of the stereotypes. There are journalists, as we know, who behave like total rats, who not only go for plagiarism and deliberate libel, leaving it to the lawyers and the paymaster to pick up the bill. Usually an expatriate owner based in America or the Channel Islands is very happy so long as the sales go on increasing. Now, those people in my book may call themselves journalists, but the deliberate purveyors of untruth are not in the same camp as those of us who seek to explore, explain, get at the difficult facts, and by God they're difficult, in a war situation. During the cowboy years in Belfast, the Hall of Mirrors, I ceased to trust any government statement, any statement from military headquarters. I could not rely upon eyewitnesses who were instantly polarized in their views as to what had happened in a street battle. I then started to look at the autopsy reports. I found even those were cooked in the interest of propaganda, until eventually I started to halt the mortuaries to identify whether the victim had died from an entry wound in the front or the back. Now, that is about a search for truth. I was proud to work with Insight for several years as the chief of war and defence correspondent of the Sunday Times, and I will not be put in the same camp, however obliquely, as people writing for the red tops in some cases who are happy to sit back, accept the handout and the retread government propaganda statement and to publish that as if it's the truth. So there is a distinction to be made among different types of journalists, and sure as hell, in my view, there is a distinction to be made between professional freelance soldiers who are performing a useful task and those who are psychopathic mercenaries whose agenda is usually as with the Wonga plot. They're not seeking to sustain good governance, they're seeking to bring down good governance, to undermine it, whether, as Warren Wont would argue, in supporting an oil industry in Nigeria. I speak as somebody who was...
And Tony, if I can pick up with you there and actually
that Biafran war,
put that question to
yes,
Ruth,
okay.
the whole issue about good or bad. Because what you seem to be saying is that most of these organisations in the end are doing harm, but do you not acknowledge that in some cases it would be impossible for certain things to happen, reconstruction, aid work, journalism in some cases, if there were not security personnel present with those people on the ground?
I think, I guess you're talking about Iraq here in that sense.
Or Afghanistan,
yeah.
or other places where now increasingly security contractors will go with other experts.
I mean, this sense of good or bad, I think something Bob was saying about, you know, the idea of it being focused very much now on the individual, are individuals mercenaries or not? And I think that's really not the point. The point is the companies and what the companies are doing and company accountability. You know, this isn't about whether an individual commits a crime, it's the company that's committed the crime and that sense of accountability down that line. I think there isn't good or bad, you know, there's probably good or bad companies. I think what the issue is the situation and the context and how accountable they are in that context. And so the debate around government regulation is a debate around particular activities, particular countries, particular contexts. And for us, it's very clear that combat and combat support is unacceptable, that there is a line that's being crossed that certainly in Iraq makes it impossible for companies to operate without engaging in conflict and therefore being part of that conflict. And I think there is, you know, something.
But does that apply to a security team that is, say, protecting a UN election team during the elections in 2005 in Iraq? I mean, does that same thing apply?
I think if the presence of that company, the activity of that company is fueling the conflict, is making the situation worse, is adding to the security problems for the Iraqi people and is adding to the human rights abuses, then the issue is about the journalists out there and the UN and the NGOs have chosen to use them and the governments are choosing to use them, that the onus is on them to be able to prove that they have a right to be there. It's not on the Iraqi people to kind of have to put up with them because they've decided they want to be there because they have the greater good, the idea that, you know, they're right. I think that presumption is arrogant and something we need to be looking at, that we've allowed this, you know, the journalists out there who've been embedded with the, you know, with the military initially are now embedded with PMSCs. That's an issue, that's a problem, but it's our problem. And for me and for War on Want, and very much in the UK, you know, when Andy was saying that, you know, he finds regulation, you know, it's an easy term to chuck out there. I think we've had the opposite thing in the UK, that regulation is the dirty word, that God forbid you'd regulate anything, and that's been part of the problem. I mean, we've been working very closely with government officials on this, and it's very much been that, you know, the part of the slowing of the process is we can't touch this. And I absolutely agree with Andy that the issue is about monitoring and about accountability, and at the moment there is no monitoring, no accountability, and you cannot monitor in Baghdad. You know, you cannot monitor them on the ground. So, you know, they shouldn't be there. If they can't be monitored, if they can't be accountable, if there isn't a line of command like you have within the armed forces, if there's not democratic oversight, then they shouldn't be there, because what they're doing is fueling conflict and profiting from conflict, and that's not something we should be supporting.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions. The gentleman there was first to put his hand up, and sorry, and please tell us who you are. I should have said that beforehand. So yeah.
My name is Malcolm Cheshire. I'm Executive Principal of the Outward Centre. I'm a security consultant, and I'm also what the first speaker referred to as a modern-day Florence Nightingale, in the sense that I've been a registered nurse for the past 30 years, 10 of that within the military. That perhaps, in my view, is part of the solution, that we've been looking at the regulation of perhaps companies. And I would respectfully disagree with Andy Burpark and suggest that the solution is actually controlling the foot soldiers in the way that the nursing profession controls the individual registered nurse, who is part of a profession which has an accepted body of knowledge. It has a code of professional conduct, and it has practitioners rather than operatives that are accountable to this. So my question is, should we, in terms of regulation, be looking at the individual practitioner rather than the company?
And who's your question to, first of all?
To Andy and then the rest
first
of the
of all.
panel.
Yep, okay.
The short answer is yes. I find it very difficult when people say they disagree with me without knowing what my view is. I agree with you entirely. No, I said foot soldiers will always misbehave, just in the same way that a registered nurse was responsible for quite a few deaths at one stage, as I recall. But that's not to argue that you shouldn't have those standards. And no, I entirely agree that what you want is some sort of association, it's not the one I run at the moment, which actually can do that certification and say, yes, the individuals do have the skills that are required. The only reason that I will now momentarily hesitate is that I think that's an excellent idea. I'm 100% supportive of it, but it's not that much of a solution again, because this is such an international business. And most of the problems that have occurred over the last 3 or 4 years, I'm not defending every British person by any means, but most of the problems that have occurred have been with third country nationals, have been with the Americans. But the idea of having some form of individual certification, I have no disagreement with you at all.
Okay, another question. Yeah, gentleman just there. And again, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Philip Keller. I'm currently with King's College and also military intelligence officer with Euro headquarters. Actually, we addressed a couple of points, so forgive me just tipping maybe on one or two. And maybe for Andrew in particular. The thing is, first of all, the term mercenary, we heard a couple of definitions actually. The only legal definition I know is from the additional protocol, 1977, additional protocol of the Geneva Convention. Would you agree on that? That's the only legal definition, binding definition by nowadays standards. Second thing is, the future of the market, maybe 10 years down the road after the Iraq bubble, do you see, let's say, any like kind of Chapter 7 things going on with the UN, maybe because the African Union proved itself not to be really a reliable conductor of these kind of missions, in particular in Africa. Third point might be, it's a very special one actually. We have about 180,000 contractors currently operating in Iraq. these are not part of the command control structure. They don't share the information. It's not part of the C3IR system, we call it in the military, the command control communication intelligence reconnaissance system. Do you see a lot of the problems going on at the moment, like the shootouts on the streets and so on, actually occurring from that problem that there's no information shared? They are outsourced, so how can they get the information the military has? And
I don't want to interrupt you, but I think if there's a fourth question, that will have to be the last.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I promise to keep it short and sweet. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, that's all for you, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. On the definition point, you're absolutely right. The legal definition is the one in the protocol. And I actually brought it with me tonight, but don't worry, I'm not going to read it out because it's 2 pages long. And as I think Tony's pointed out, that's the definition which, if you get prosecuted under it and you fail, you get prosecuted and lose your case, the only person who should be shot is your lawyer. It's just not applicable. The world has moved on. So using that UN definition today can cause immense interest at UN conferences, but it wouldn't help any of us in this room in the real world at all. At the other extreme on the definitional side was, I did actually do a quick Google just before I came across, and on the first, this is not scientific, on the first internet dictionary I came across, the definition of a mercenary was working or acting merely for money or other reward, semicolon, venal. Well, I had to check what venal meant, actually. But certainly if you stop at the semicolon, as I say, that applies to people in this room. So it comes back to Adam's point that we know what we mean by mercenaries, and there is a problem because there's an emotional attachment. One colleague was saying in his book that if we call you a mercenary, you'll throw me out the window. You said not tonight. People are concerned about the use of the word. On the other side of the fence, there are people who say, well, no, it just sort of sums it all up anyway. So the definition is a problem, but it's one that we live with. And my members would probably walk out if you accuse them of being mercenary companies. I will never walk out. I'll carry on and do the debate. I think the far more interesting one, which we haven't got time for tonight, is the distinction between private security and private military. But that's a totally different definitional issue. On the chapter, sorry, I'll try and do quick answers. I know there are more questions. On the Chapter 7 thing, one day, we're not there yet, but the reality is that we already use private contractors to deliver food in Darfur. One day, somebody is going to say, well, hang on, the African Union doesn't have the forces. Now, going back, say, 4 years, I'd have said there was actually quite a bit of support for the idea of using private security companies in a place like Darfur. Eric Prince of Blackwater probably put the whole thing back 5 years by saying he'd do it and send in a brigade size, whatever it was. And then it's been put back again by the fact that countries, including the US, are prepared to put some more money into training the African Union peacekeepers. But it's an issue that will always be out there, but it's not one the private security companies actually have much of a say in. This is how governments behave and what they want to do, and at some stage do they want to subcontract. On the third point, just to lay it to bed, if there are 180,000 contractors in Iraq today, and maybe they are, please trust me, I know you don't, but please trust me, only about 25,000 of those are carrying guns. The higher figures that go up there include the cooks, the laundry people, etc. They really do to get to those big figures. The best figure we ever had for people carrying guns was a maximum of 30 to 35,000, which is now down to 25,000. Is the information sharing a major problem? Yes, because we don't yet have proper command and control and communication between the PSCs and the militaries of the world. It's something that's been growing up over the last 4 or 5 years, since Iraq, if you like. Baghdad was the first time that was really needed, and so people have had to learn, and that learning curve is still going on. But information and intelligence sharing is still very, very imperfect indeed. Does that lead to incidents? Yes, in some cases it most certainly does.
Can I quickly come in on the Chapter 7 point? A few years ago, people used to talk about the Rwandan genocide, and if only private military companies had been allowed to go in and stop that, it would have been fine because no one else was going to go in. The Americans weren't going to go in because of their experience in Somalia. The British and the French were just too distant and uninterested. But if only they'd allowed private companies to go in, they could have done something to stop that, and the latest one was Darfur. I think that ultimately is probably nonsense. The idea that you would subcontract your foreign policy to a private group is fantasy. partly what we've seen in Iraq is a little bit of your foreign policy being subcontracted to private groups, but the idea that you're only slightly interested in making a difference in Darfur, so you won't do anything yourself, you won't dare to send your own soldiers, but you'll pay for some mercenaries to go. Sorry, Bob, don't shut me out the window. You'll pay for someone else to go in and do it for you, I think is fantasy. And I think this sort of phrase is used sometimes to sort of talk about PMCs having a great noble role in the world. Some of the same guys involved in the Wonga coup talked about bringing democracy or getting rid of a nasty government in Equatorial Guinea. It sounds to me like propaganda rather than normality, really.
Ruth's got a quick point, so
just
then
to say,
I'll let
I
Andy
mean,
respond.
just very quickly on that sense that, you know, would it ever happen? I mean, at the moment, we're seeing these companies being used to outsource Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. I mean, they're now starting to outsource the checkpoints. You know, when are they going to start outsourcing the checkpoints within the West Bank, the settlement control? I mean, we're talking about an illegal construct, an illegal occupation that's being partly outsourced now, and that sense, I think that sense of being able to distance yourself, a government distancing itself from its aspects of its foreign policy, that is part of this process and that is already happening. But I agree with you that the notion that because we can't deal with the complexities of foreign policy issues, that outsourcing them to private contractors is the way forward is quite a terrifying notion, really.
Andy, you've got a quick point.
Very briefly. We could sit here for days, as some worthy organisations do, discussing codes of conduct. I believe CPA Order Number 18 is full of Boy Scout-like phrases, is it not? About
17.
17. 17.
Thank you very much. What is absent is any viable process of the enforcement of control. That potentially exists and could exist in reality very easily through the International Criminal Court. Mention has been made of Karadzic. Of course, he will not appear before the ICC. He will appear before, as you know, the Special Tribunal at The Hague, which is a one-off ad hoc tribunal for that particular conflict. The ICC, properly armed, properly policed, properly supported, would be at least the beginnings of a system of jurisdiction which would be able to impose sanctions upon those who transgress human rights, whether they are disguised as mercenaries or whether their political activities are in some other area. Let me repeat something I said earlier. It is the United States government which constantly undermines efforts to give real muscle, real power to the ICC. Not only does Washington not recognize the ICC itself, because it doesn't want American citizens appearing before what it would regard as show trials, it also ensures that other governments, which are, in spite of Adam Roberts' belief that the state is still powerful, there are states in this world which are subject to American pressure because they depend upon American aid. And threats have been made repeatedly, and the Belgians have protested, among others, about this. Threats have been made to those governments that if you sign up to the ICC, then your US aid will cease. Why should that be the case? Let me remind you of a famous aphorism from an American president, probably Coolidge, I think. The business of America is business. The American tradition of the use of privatized lethal force comes out of America. It is something that they regard as normal. A corporation, in certain circumstances, is regarded as being legitimized in its use of lethal force. It is a different concept from that which we share here. And I would suggest, and I hope somebody will come back and rebut this, but I would suggest, and I would argue, that the American position is that which actually ultimately authenticates the apparent chaos that exists in the use of privatized force in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay, another question, and the lady here was first in.
Adam, would you talk about the money trail? And in particular, I'm thinking how that might be an avenue, a little
And sorry, could you say who you are? Just introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Marianne Nicholas, and had worked with Adam on a BBC film called The Coup that dealt with Simon Mann's pursuits. But in short, again, we've sort of neglected the issue of international banking and the fact that that's the web that unites a lot of this when you get into jurisdictional issues, et cetera. And I'm wondering about the money trail and if greater transparency with banking and might enable better oversight when, shall we say, legitimate use perhaps of private military security forces goes awry.
That's not a gift of a question, is it? I mean, the money trail in the Wonga coup is incredibly complicated and probably is legally very, very difficult to even touch on. But you know, the supposed investors, the possible investors in the whole plot, range from B-list celebrities to possibly sons of famous people. I mean, yes, I suppose if we all had, you know, transparent bank accounts and we all knew where money was going, we would know a lot more about the very dodgy end of the mercenary scale of things. And I suppose a lot of what we've learned about the Wonga coup has come from knowing about bank account details, and some of those have been leaked by certain lawyers and others into the public arena. So we know some details of who provided money to Simon Mann in the build-up to the coup plot, and that tells us quite a lot about who is sort of inclined to invest in this sort of extreme mercenary behaviour. And what we may now get, I mean, the next thing we might see from the whole Wonga coup story is another tranche of bank accounts being either made public or being used in possibly in courts at some point. But so yeah, I mean, your question is to the nub of some things that, you know, we would learn a lot more about how these activities were organised and financed if we could follow the money trails. But making, you know, places like Guernsey and Jersey or the, you know, islands in the Caribbean become transparent would be to sort of revolutionise the international capitalist system. I think it's unlikely to happen because of mercenaries or because of coup plots. Oh, those mercenaries. Well, I guess if the Quinnet Crunch brings the end of the world capitalist system, we may have something else as well. I think that's unlikely. But yeah, I mean, the nub of this thing often is you follow the money and you find the interesting people by following the bank account payments and, you know, the transfers. But it's not easy to do, and you know it very well. It's a very murky world to get into. That's a really unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry.
Got another question at the back. Yeah, that's right next there.
My name's Matt Watley. I am a security consultant, but to put things into perspective, I've worked for about 8 television companies, 4 NGOs, and I'm a former army officer. My question, Andy, despite all the criticism you're receiving this evening, and I'm not entirely convinced by the links that are allegedly being drawn between various coups and attempted coups in Africa and modern-day private security companies. I think that it would be foolish to suggest that private companies can't provide a magnificently useful service to society. We see that in the food industry, we see it in all industries all over the world, that just because something is done privately doesn't mean it's bad. Generally, I would say that things that are done by the government are done generally inefficiently. And so the argument that just because something is done privately, like security for journalists, therefore it's a bad thing, I think is meaningless and ill thought out. But there are things related to private security companies which possibly are not being addressed properly. One of them, as a former army officer myself, where I have friends who have suffered enormously over many years because of the conflicts they've been involved in. I wonder how much effort has been put in by the British Association of Private Security Companies into the aspects of post-traumatic stress, which people in Iraq that I've worked with and in Afghanistan I work with do suffer from now and will suffer from in 10 or 20 years' time. Is it something which your association is giving any thought to at all? Thank you.
Yes. We have been involved with 2 academic organisations academic stroke medical organisations who were able to provide thinking, if you like, on post-traumatic stress disorder. And as a result of that, we organised and facilitated a number of seminars where we managed to get all our members in to sensitise them to an issue which perhaps they didn't need sensitising to, but perhaps to some extent some of them did. And so we organised these seminars to sensitise them to the issue. We then facilitated contacts between providers of assistance with PTSD and the various companies. Now, that's all work that we did in 2007. In 2008, what we're seeing is that the companies are taking up the services of some of these providers. But it's an issue that we will never, ever, if you like, let go of, because our concern will always be that when the market turns down, you start cutting out to get your bottom line back into order.
The government funding any of that?
No, the government provide no funding of any description. So this is the companies funding it themselves through us. But the answer is that it's an issue we've been very, very sensitised to. We've put a lot of work into getting the companies to move forward. This is a journey where we are nowhere near the end of the journey. This will be a journey that will go on for several years, and it links back into the idea of individual membership and individual qualifications, because it's a very sensitive area as well, where individuals are concerned not to do themselves out of the job market, etc. So for instance, one company, not one of my companies, an associated company, was devising a self-help internet-based course, test if you like, which people could do anonymously to see if they might need help. So there are a lot of developments out there, and we're very, very pleased to be associated with them.
Another question. Gentleman there at the corner next to the picture.
My question, my name is Richard Brown. My question is about the management of risk, because the private security companies clearly are, as has been said earlier, their main objective is to make a profit, and they will make the best profit so they can protect their reputation and ensuring there are no casualties on the people they're protecting. And actually, if you're in the services, your perspective on management of risk is slightly different, because although you're obviously trying to reduce casualties, keep casualties at a minimum, you're also trying to achieve the objective. And my experience is that sometimes the private security companies, aided by the government's perspective that they don't want casualties on their civilian side, actually prevent some of the missions being achieved in the most optimal way. And that actually the military are much more effective because they can see a much better balance of risk. And I'd like just to, Andy particularly, to answer that one and see if he agrees with that or not.
All the questions to you, Andy. So.
It's a very important issue. It's a very, very difficult balance, and the companies, in a sense, are driven by the client, usually in these cases governments, and what the government's prepared to accept. And the annoying position that, for instance, I'm a former Department for International Development official. One of the annoying things now is that my current colleagues get slagged off a lot in the press for what they are or aren't doing in Helmand province, but the reality is that they're having to operate under security restrictions which are much more severe in risk avoidance terms than the military would work under, and indeed than they are prepared to work under themselves. So you do have issues out there that require debate, and there are a lot of people, myself included, who feel that we haven't got that balance right yet. If you look across the American experience, for instance, with the protection of certain American government officials, the job description is zero chance of the person being killed. There are two ways of achieving that, to be very extreme. One is never to go anywhere. That way you're going to be okay. The other way is to kill everybody in your sight to make sure that they can't kill you. I am not accusing any individual firm of operating in either of those ways, but I am saying it's a spectrum out there that really hasn't been thought through and debated to the end yet. When I was in Iraq, the Americans accepted themselves that they had moved far beyond the risk threshold of State Department. In other words, there was no rule book anymore. There should be no State Department officials in Iraq, full stop. But there were. So that puts you into very, very murky waters.
Now, we're starting to run out of time, but I'll take a few more questions. Let's see. The lady just there, first of all.
Thanks, Sarah Ingham, King's College. These companies are simply filling a gap in the market, and the gap is caused by the continual reduction of the conventional military. And so aren't these companies just the future? Because the military is going to be cut and cut and cut. So it was the point made at the very start, was sort of back to the future.
So is that a question to Tony and to
anyone,
Andy?
Yeah, anyone.
Yeah. Tony, do you want to take it first?
Well, I suppose in an ideal world, yes, a world free of realpolitik, then yes, we would have sufficient grunts on the ground to provide the convoy escort duties and so on, which are now being met by the private sector. One could draw an analogy, perhaps I would, with the absence of military hospitals in this country. It's disgraceful that soldiers come back grievously injured, regular soldiers, into hospital conditions which Florence Nightingale would not have approved of. It is part of a decision by successive governments to support a consumerist, and I, as an old dinosaur, I experienced my first combat in central London at the age of 8, when the first Great London Blitz started. By the age of 12, I was a war veteran. My generation would perceive the, if you like, the dedication to consumerism as a thing which is not in the national interest, it's not good morally, and so on and so on. But that is the way life is. And if you opt to run down your regular forces to an unnatural extent, witness the comments made by the late Colonel of 3 Para, as published in the Sunday Times on Sunday, then you get a military catastrophe. That might have happened, it hasn't happened, in part, as you correctly infer, due to the presence of private security operators. In turn, that creates problems of legal, moral problems of all sorts, and that is where we are. I cannot somehow see a return, for example, to national conscription, to send young men into wars which people of my generation were expected and did fight, whether in Korea, Malaya, or in the Egyptian desert. It would just be politically unacceptable. NATO is proving very, very reluctant to get deeply involved in Afghanistan. The problem is the failure of governments to acknowledge that simple truth and to say, yes, we must therefore come out of situations which we cannot sustain militarily and politically. There we are. They're living in a fool's paradise. It's Alice in Wonderland time.
I mean, my only thing to add is I think it's more that the wars are getting bigger. I mean, this is, you know, what we've seen in the last few years is about these endless wars that we're getting ourselves into. So this idea that, you know, that this is something that just has to fill a gap. I mean, people, you know, the government knew full well before they went into Iraq that there was, you know, there wouldn't necessarily be the army to carry out the endless war. They've now got an endless war in Afghanistan. So, and the role of the private sector in that has been a conscious decision. You know, this isn't just about just not having capacity. It's about actually consciously enabling this to happen. And that's why the onus has to be on the UK government to take responsibility for what they've done and bring in regulation and to control this sector.
If I can sort of just abuse my privilege then, just to ask a quick question of the panel. In some ways, though, are we not talking about this is just what's happening with private security companies, private military companies, whatever we want to call them, is just a response to the current conflicts? And Tony, with your kind of view looking back over the history of this, maybe there's no point in talking about regulation because it'll change according to the next conflict, and perhaps the whole private security industry will fade away as the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts perhaps eventually fade away.
I'm glad you use eventually. I'm sorry to be boring in repetition, and I really will keep this short. There is a determining power here, and it's in the United States. The United States marketing policy, strategy, the US is still the only military superpower. And therefore, if political opinion can be ameliorated in America in order to accept a greater degree of control of its commerce and the way its commerce is now practiced, then we might make some progress. Otherwise, nobody has sufficient clout to reform the system. It will evolve We don't know how it will evolve, but it's going to be a very bumpy ride. Of that I'm sure.
But the private security industry as it is now did not really exist before Iraq and Afghanistan. It did, but nothing like on the scale. It is a response to those conflicts, isn't it, Andy?
No, it's a commercial response to those conflicts, but also a commercial response to a more unstable world. If you look at the figures from the IISS, the number of conflicts is decreasing, the number of casualties is decreasing, but the commercial sector is having to operate more and more in unstable environments. Iraq is not the flavour of the month, but I mean, it's the thing everybody wants to talk about. I would actually be far more worried about the 20,000 Chinese private security company operatives who are down in Angola at the moment. There I think you've got real issues to be worried about. You don't need to worry quite so much about the 100 armour group guys up there in Kabul. So I think that the way the world is going, these issues don't go away.
Well, I tell you what, I'll take one more question. Oh, there's a whole load of hands. This is going to be difficult, isn't it? Gentleman there, you put your hand up first. So
very quick question. Sorry. My name is Mark Hollingsworth. Why is the government resisting regulation?
Good question. I mean, we've been involved in this a while, and what we've seen is obviously 2002 you had the Green Paper, and this was due to Sandline. Back in 2005 you then had Jack Straw saying, right, we have to have some sort of internal discussion about this. And we've seen a very long, very slow process of each of the departments putting in their bit. And as far as we know, it then went to the Foreign Secretary at the beginning of this year, and there was an expectation something was going to happen. And you know, to the point that a consultation, you know, we've seen a paper that was essentially outlining what a consultation would look like on regulation. And it hasn't happened. It's been pushed back out. The government, Mark Mallet-Brown is doing a very good job of constantly apologising as if it's some sort of out of his hand situation. And I think it is partly because they're complicit, because they want this situation to continue, and they're just trying to work out how it should happen. I think part of it is keeping their fingers crossed that they don't get a Blackwater in the UK. And you know, so far the British industry, despite being so vast and so integral to this process, just hasn't had the same coverage as the US companies have. And so I think those two things are very much part of it. And there's been this thing called the Better Regulations Executive that Tony Blair put right at the top of the Cabinet Office, that all sorts of regulation had to go through. And this notion that you can't have regulation, you know, that's just off the table. And I think there has been this block there, and that has now moved, and we should be in a situation where something happens. And we had the Foreign Affairs Select Committee this week saying, you know, this is ridiculous. You know, it has to be in the next Queen's speech. This is too urgent and too important not to act. So I think, you know, if the pressure continues to be put on them, they have to do something now. But it's been fairly impressive how much they've managed to avoid doing something on this.
Andy, what's your response?
A, I never speak for the British government because they don't pay me anymore. But B, if it's difficult, don't do anything about it. And if it's difficult and you know that the British public doesn't really care anyway, I'll just put it in the tray for next week.
Does the Yes Minister?
I can't prove that, but it's very noticeable to me the lack of interest from the UK press in these issues. I'm delighted that people in this room are so interested. But you remember, Ruth, when you put out that press statement when you were threatening to take the Foreign Secretary to judicial review or whatever for not making a decision, I got phoned up by 2 journalists to comment on that. My press people, that's me by the way, did a Google search the following Monday. The Guardian had run it, no other national ran it, and it appeared in the Teesside Gazette. And one has to take that as being cynically some measure of how interested the British public are, and ministers respond to public pressure.
Although we were very impressed at the last PMSCs conference to see our headlines all over. The first event was all about PR and how this industry can legitimise itself, and you know, and to say no one's looking, I think the industry's looking at what happened.
Very briefly, Tony, why has regulation failed so far?
Because there's not been the will there. Also remember that this is not an homogeneous industry. There are competing companies. Andy will confirm that it's been extremely difficult historically to persuade companies to collaborate with one another. I'm now just talking about the British-run companies, because they are rivals of one another. It's rather like trying to get a bunch of journalists to collaborate on a story. If ever you've been in an Allied press information centre, a long way from the front line, and a group of journalists have to be selected to report on behalf of the rest, it's murder. I mean, they just do not want to work as a group. And the same applies, I think, to commercial companies. So that is one factor. The other is that, as one member of the Foreign Office team confessed to me when I was researching my own book, nobody wants to be responsible for holding the hot potato of mercenary activity, regulating mercenary activity, when there are no votes in it. So that is where the matter lies. There is a cyclical experience. This is that every time there is some sort of scandal, some sort of massacre, a la Angola 1976, or the Wonga plot, then there's a great furore, and people start demanding regulation. There is then usually a parliamentary committee or two, as followed the Sandline affair. Reports pour out of every crevice in Whitehall. Various officials cover their arses with great dexterity. And then there is a commission which inquires. That wonderful historian, A.P. Herbert, wrote a comic verse about the Royal Commission on Kissing. I've been sitting since 1902, and it's only one man left standing to report. That is the kind of dynamic that you get into, and eventually the whole thing kind of drifts blissfully away, because following the current government's, and certainly Blair's view that the public attention will wane after about 11 days, the public gets bored with the thing. And so that's it. It's easier to let it slip away, adopt a policy of laissez-faire. And that's exactly where we are now with this problem.
Well, thank you very much. Well, perhaps not surprising in some ways that regulation hasn't gone very far when you look at the acronym soup of what we've been discussing this evening. We've got PSCs, PMCs, PMSCs, CSCs, that's a new one, PSOs and PSDs, and we still haven't really come to a definition. But I'll leave you with one thought. There's an interview today with Eric Prince, the CEO of Blackwater, which have now sort of become the icon almost of the private security industry, and he's saying that he's looking to get out of the security business. So who knows? We'll see what happens next. Thanks very much for coming.